wonderful. I wish I could say more about that, and I'm sorry that I can't. And we are 2 minutes over, so I'm gonna bring our next guest in, Andrew Pledger.
Hey, Casey.
Hello. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes, I can. I'm gonna move to the middle just a tad there. Perfect. There we go. Okay.
It's so good to see you, Andrew. How are you doing today?
Oof. Yeah. Honestly, it has been an emotionally hard day. I've been watching the Shining Happy People
Ah.
documentary today that's on Prime that's about the Duggars and the IBLP. So I haven't finished it yet. I've been taking breaks throughout the day. But that it's been really eye-opening, really validating, but also really emotional for that.
You are drawing all sorts of parallels with your own personal experiences.
Yes, and it's interesting because I was never a part of the IBLP. I grew up in the IFB cult, Independent Fundamental Baptist, but they both have the same teachings. They do, but Bill Gothard, he had his own organization that pushed them in specific ways, like through the Advanced Training Institute and all the seminars and stuff that he did.
It's a difficult place to put yourself in, I imagine, when you want to watch things out of curiosity, for educational purposes, but also and also as a content creator, but then to also have the other side of that of being personally affected and triggered by the things that you're watching on screen, remembering things that perhaps you had forgotten about, and then adding a few more things to your list of recovery items, I imagine.
hmm Yeah, definitely, and I'm excited too because like I've been trying to like start kind of exposing myself to that kind of stuff as I've been on my healing journey and as I've been working through triggers. And I'm really excited to be in a book club with you,
Mhm.
Casey.
And Nicole in the chat. Hi, Nicole. Thanks for organizing it.
Yes, thank you, Nicole. But yeah, because like I think I had told you, Casey, like I've never gotten through a cult memoir. Like I'll start them, but I'll never finish them. And like I'm a major reader, but like they're just too much for me. So I'm glad I'm in a book club to hold me accountable for that to see. I think I'll be able to hopefully get through that.
What's really nice about the book club though is that it's made up of people that would be, just kind of like, oh, chapter 1 to 3 for Andrew. That's great.
That's
I mean,
true.
any
Yeah.
input is still input. So I think that that's what's really going to be really nice about that
hmm
environment. And today we're going to be talking about the different ways to tell your story and trying to find the right one for you. And the reason I chose this particular panel topic with yourself, Andrew, is because I feel like you have um, told your story in different ways, with other people and on your own terms as well. So perhaps because I haven't actually released our interview yet, we should start by saying, hi, Andrew, please introduce yourself to the listeners.
Yeah, so for those who don't know me, my name is Andrew Pledger, and I was born in a religious cult that was a part of the independent fundamental Baptist movement. I was homeschooled my entire life for the purpose of indoctrination. My parents used a IFB based homeschooling curriculum called Abeka, which is produced by Pensacola Christian College, an IFB related college. My parents, they were raised in it. They weren't necessarily born into it. Their parents got involved in it, and it really they became so passionate about it and so devoted. It gave them such a strong sense of purpose, a strong sense of community, a lot of structure in their lives. And because they had a lot of, or still have a lot of these fundamentalist beliefs, they see the modern world and modernism as a major threat. So to them, isolating from society and any information that contradicted was a way for them to protect themselves and their beliefs. And then they saw the outside world as an evil awful place and wanted to isolate me and my brothers from that. And homeschooling was a how that was done. And so, yeah, my life was being homeschooled and then being a part of this cult church. And there were some other activities that I did get involved with. I was in a homeschool group and a 4-H club, but it was mainly Christian. And I was still really out of place in those environments because those people weren't extreme like my family. We were like the really extreme, weird religious family, I guess you would say. Um, and it was really awkward because a lot of former cult members who had left the cult that I grew up in, they were in this. Some of them were in this homeschool group, so there was like tension with that
Mhm.
because my especially hearing my mom, she just and really my dad too, they had a extreme devotion to the pastor or really the leader in that group. And when people left, were so offended because they saw that as being unloyal or unfaithful to the leader. And there were just so many signs growing up, but I didn't have the language or the understanding for that. Like, the leader, he had his own name with his own parking spot in the parking lot. You went into the building and there was a portrait of him on the wall. And I remember a service where a member prayed to God to help everyone to become more like our leader and not be more like Jesus. So just looking back, those cult tendencies, and just the demand for like isolation from society and not exposing ourselves to information that was contradictory, and the church highly encouraged homeschooling or going to their Christian school in their own little indoctrination machine that they had. So yeah, I was raised in that, and also finding out later on that I was gay. It took me a long I mean, growing up, I only heard the term like sodomite, so really extreme language.
Yeah.
And in that environment, being gay was one of the worst things that you could be. Like I remember like you were compared to murderers, you were compared to pedophiles in that environment. So growing up in that, already experiencing a lot of trauma for a lot of the harmful teachings about sexuality, about hell, very fear and shame based. And they also really emphasized the end times. They had a very strong sense of urgency. They didn't try to guess when it was going to happen, but they kind of used that to scare everyone. Like
Right.
it would come back any second, any hour. And when I remember when gay marriage was legalized in the US in 2015, that the group then saw that as another sign. Oh, the end times are here. They saw it because I think in their belief system, they saw that as America becoming more and more depraved. Um, and you know the Bible
Mm.
has a lot of general things about the end times. And so there are things like, so whenever political stuff would happen or an earthquake would happen, they would heart back down. And oh my gosh, like when the pandemic happened,
Mm.
oh, that was a lot. Like my even though at that point I had like was deconstructing from that, a lot of rapture anxiety. But I grew up in that experienced I was exposed to a lot of emotional, psychological abuse, constant control, constant monitoring, really fearing like of my own safety and my family because of like the hateful rhetoric that my parents would say about queer people because they the cult loved the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and my parents were like, well, you know what, they all deserve that, this to be burned alive and destroyed. So to hear that violent rhetoric meant, oh, like I can't be myself, I can't show them who I am, like I will be unsafe because I'm the person that's so awful that they're talking about. So there's a lot of trauma just from that. And my parents, like, they were really radical Christians. I was taught things like interracial marriage was a sin. I was told I could not marry someone of a woman of a different race. And of course, they obviously didn't know I was gay. So, like, it was in that awkward moment, it's like, well, I'm not going to marry a woman. So that's just not going to happen. So those are just some extreme Um, oh, hey, sorry, I'm
Hi,
looking at the
Siren.
comments. And so it's just some of these extreme beliefs, and I remember my own dad justifying slavery, justifying the genocide of Indians, just all these different things justified. And there would be, even though I was so indoctrinated in this system of control, I would still like have those moments where like something inside of me, like I felt uncomfortable about these things going on. And I was ready to leave the IFB movement at 17. And, I was about to graduate from being homeschooled because I was homeschooled K through 12. And, at that point, and it's really interesting to see the growth because I've recently started getting back into editing the second draft of my memoir, and I forgot about some things that I'm like, oh my gosh, I forgot I felt this way, or I
Right.
was like this at this moment. But it was a couple of days ago, I was reading what I had written and how I was too afraid to disobey my parents because I thought that God would punish me, God would not bless me because growing up, I was always taught you always obey authority no matter what. And that's going against God if you do. And I was told growing up, like, if you disobey authority or you disobey your parents, God will shorten your life. So I was so scared to have a short life from disobeying my parents. I was very obedient, major rule follower. And so I remember reading that and I was like, "Oh my gosh, like even like as I'm heading into college, I'm too afraid to go against my parents' wishes of going to a fundamentalist college." And I ended up at Bob Jones University for 3.5 years. So I go from the IFB cult into another cult, Bob Jones University. And the sad thing was Bob Jones wasn't as extreme as the environment that I grew up in. And it was still an awful environment, very cultic, very controlling, still constantly monitored, all these rules to follow. You're treated like a child, constant room inspections, all these required activities. Oh, all these different elements of control that they had when I'm a college student.
You do a big sigh, and I remember saying during our interview that I was exhausted listening to you list off all the different ways in which you're controlled and monitored at Bob Jones University.
Hmm.
Um, so that's a nice segue into saying that Surviving Bob Jones University is a limited podcast series available by Andrew Pledger that comes out this summer.
Yes, it is coming out in August, and I'm so excited for it. Whew, it's been really hard to make. I've had to take some breaks. I've lost a lot of hours of sleep and definitely a lot of triggers. So I've been having to, take a step back, then get back to it. But I'm glad that I originally it was going to come out earlier, but I'm glad I decided to push it till August because I'm gonna need that time to edit it, perfect it, and like still take that time to rest. But yeah, I decided to do it. It was like right around the time when I finished my college classes. And for people who don't know, I was expelled from Bob Jones my senior year, my very last semester. And it was because I publicly told my story of like growing up in the IFB, being a queer person, and denouncing its teachings as just harmful and toxic and abusive. And so I was expelled for that. And there was a lot that happened those 3 years at Bob Jones University. A lot of freshman year I was harassed a lot because of my perceived sexual orientation from people on campus. um just constantly living in fear and just so much anxiety, struggling with depression, not being able to just be myself at all, being triggered so much by their toxic messaging that I heard my entire life. I eventually ended up in conversion therapy at Bob
Gosh.
Jones University for a short time. And, thankfully, it was my freshman year at Bob Jones that I got really depressed And that's when I was able to really, like, it was my first moment of, like, claiming my autonomy and, like, really majorly going against the system and disobeying rules because I was so scared to break the rules because I thought God was gonna judge me. Like, they had that indoctrination so ingrained, and it was so hard, and when you broke rules or you did something bad, you're really taught to confess to yourself and confess to God, and you like get back in line and continue following the rules, and is a constant cycle of that. But for me, like, I had to break that cycle to kind of meet my own needs because I was like, okay, well, God's not doing anything for me. And he's like, this is a terrible environment. I was hopeless. I was in despair. I didn't know how I would ever get out or how I would ever leave that environment because it had been my whole world. I didn't know anyone on the
Yeah.
outside. And so that's when I decided to start exploring outside the group. And I know like we've had this conversation, so like you know everything. But
I love your story of rebellion though, and the reason I smiled when you talked about falling into a deep depression was because I thought you were going to mention the people that you met
mhm,
outside of Bob Jones University who were really strong
yeah.
allies of
Mhm,
yours. Which is a beautiful story. I don't want to
yeah.
give too much away, especially if you're writing a book, and also because we've talked about it in our interview, which is going to come out in the next few weeks.
Mhm.
But it's there are ups and downs
Ooh.
that you explore just in your time at Bob Jones. So
Mhm.
there's like of
Yeah.
course, as with everyone's
Mhm.
stories,
Mhm.
there's a whole load of stuff.
Yeah, it is a lot, and, like, I've been adjusting the timeline and, like, fixing like, even stories that I just forgot that have come up in therapy, like, things that I'm integrating into my book, but, yes, the family, they were a big part of just escaping that environment because I would live a double life where I would go to this very liberal, very progressive, affirming church with this family. And this family, they lived across the street from Bob Jones University. And so once they got to know me, they would invite me to their house and they eventually gave me a key. So I could literally walk away from Bob Jones across the street and not be monitored, not be constantly watched, and, like, I could literally I could watch TV because I wasn't allowed to watch TV at Bob Jones University, and so just to be human, and it was really hard because a week before I met them, just a trigger warning for people, like, I nearly took my own life, and so it took me to that breaking point to, like, take ownership of my life and be like, what do I need? Because you're always taught not to trust yourself. It's always go by the group's rules, the group structure. Anything in your mind or your thoughts that are goes against that, that's of Satan, that's bad, get rid of that. So for me, like fighting past that messaging and being like, no, like this is not working. And so all those years, 3.5 years I'm there, I'm, like, trying to survive and live this double life, and the pandemic happened, so we were all separated, and I was stuck back in the environment I grew up in for a while, and so, long story short, because of more trauma experiences at Bob Jones, a lot more questioning, and me secretly, like, deconstructing at this fundamentalist Christian university, finally my junior year, like, after having that experience with conversion therapy, decided to deconvert from it completely because I'm like, my mental health is more important than having to conform to this belief system. So I deconverted and I go back to Bob Jones my senior year, no longer a part of the faith or that belief system at all. And I'm like, oh, wow. Okay. Like, I've changed a lot during this in my mind at that time. I'm like, I've changed a lot during these several years. And I left the faith that I grew up in internally. And at that point, I was still going to end up be like staying at Bob Jones University to work there because it was so familiar, even though it was so miserable. It was so awful, so toxic, but like it was familiar. And so that semester I worked on a photo art series because I studied photography at Bob Jones. that kind of helped me to really dig into emotionally the things that I went through. Um, and once I just started working on it more and more, I was like, oh my God, like I have to share this with the world. And I ended up with connecting this former famous pastor, and now he's an ex-Christian. His name is Josh Harris. And I ended up doing an interview on his Instagram with him, and it ended up like getting out at the university, and like students just started majorly sharing it. And it's because it's very rare for a student at Bob Jones to speak out against them and their teachings and the harmfulness of their environment. And so once that like started majorly being shared around, I knew it had been because whenever like when I got back, like I did this interview a day before my last semester. When I got back and people are like staring at me, whispering, I was like, oh crap. And because, I had stayed low key several years, that was kind of like my way. I majorly isolated and it was really lonely. But I was like, I have to survive. I have to isolate. No one can notice me. But at that point, I was then noticed after all that time. I was like, oh crap. Like, I'm like, somehow, like, this has definitely been shared. So I was expelled, yeah, for that interview for denouncing its teachings. And they never brought up my sexuality because they've just gotten into hot water for expelling LGBTQ students. So they couldn't use that, I don't think. Even though I still think that was a part of it, but they didn't say that. Um, so I was expelled, and thankfully, I was able to move in with that family I had met in Greenville, and I'm still with them. And I recently graduated with my bachelor's degree, so I finished college. So it feels really nice. And so, when I got the end, like towards the end with that degree, and there were some different things also. There's been a lot of things going on and leadership changes at Bob Jones University, that it really inspired me to create the series. And honestly, I don't think I've said this publicly yet, but another thing that really inspired me to make this series was, I listened to the limited podcast series called The Tribes by Tim Elliott, and he did such a fantastic job. Oh my god, it's just so incredible. And when I
Yeah.
listened to it, I was like, I want to do something like this.
Yeah. I
And
get it, I get it, I get it. And so many times I'm like, "Ooh, that could be a limited series." Yeah, Tim Elliott and Adam Dudding with The Commune, that podcast series did that to me as well. And Sarah Ferris's Conning the Con. When I listened to that, I was like, "Oh, it gets you. You start having all these ideas." So I'm really excited for Surviving Bob Jones University if that's the style
it
that
is going
you've
to be the
gone
style. Yes, I'm
for.
so excited. Yeah.
That's
But yeah.
awesome.
So yeah, since then, it's been a year and a half since I've officially like escape that environment. And it's so awkward and uncomfortable because at 17 years old, I wanted to leave that environment. I was ready, but I didn't get to leave it until I was about 22 years old. So all those still several years in it. And then
Yeah.
finally, and like I did while I was there, I was making like a several year long plan where I was going to get out by like 26 years old. That was going to, but anyways, I got out early, so that's nice.
Really interesting thing about this is on paper, when you say that it's a year and a half since you left that environment physically, I think that people can find that quite striking, especially as a lot of professionals would recommend that people wait a longer period before sharing their stories. So we're kind of diving into the panel topic now in terms of recognizing that your deconstruction was happening whilst you were still physically in the group, and with your speaking out, do you feel like that was the right platform for you at the time, or would you do things differently now, knowing what you know?
Yeah, I know. It was funny when you asked me to do this topic to like the right way to tell your story because the way I did it, like I risked it was really risky what I did still being in that group and publicly telling my story and denouncing it. And I think there's no black and white answer. And I think that's great because in cults, we're given these black and white answers: do this, don't do that, blah, 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 all this stuff. But for me, I think I had been silenced my entire life and not ever being able to speak up, express emotions, express opinions, express what I'm experiencing. I went through a lot of things through my life that I hid from my parents because it was not acceptable. I had a lot of mental health issues in my teen years, major depression, eating disorder issues in my teen years that I couldn't share with my parents, and things that we're going through because of like internalized homophobia, religious trauma, and just trauma in general from being in that environment. A lot of developmental issues also because of that group. And so when for me, it was like I was in touch with my intuition to know that it was the right thing for me. I wouldn't recommend people doing what I did. I wouldn't. um, but I knew that everything I don't know, I just had this really strong intuitive feeling that everything would be okay. It wasn't logical at all. It's very like intuition driven, and like I did like go back and forth about whether to do it because when I did this schedule this interview, it was 2 months in advance. So I had 2 months in advance to really think deeply about all the consequences, all the things that would happen. And to me, it was like I couldn't stay silent anymore. I was okay with risking everything. And I think at that
Mm.
point, I started to feel a lot of shame for being in that environment. And, of course, I was under a lot of indoctrination and mind control. But, when I really started to come off of that, I was like, my entire life has been written out for me by my parents completely. They've chosen this path for me, and I want to choose my own path. And so telling my story like that was a way for me to like claim my own identity and individuality. And it was just, I remember after it happened, it was like a weight had just been lifted because I was able to tell my story with someone who is safe. I think you need to be able to tell your story with someone who's safe. And when you tell your story, you don't have to do it publicly.
Oh,
You don't have to. You can literally go to a therapist and tell your story. You can tell a very trusted, good friend your story, or you could just write your story down in a journal to help like getting it out. And that really helped me a lot when I couldn't like vocally speak up about things is like I just and really that's how my book started, which in the beginning I never thought it would turn into a memoir, but it was just me getting all of this crap out that I have never been able to tell anyone, and it just kind of just kept adding and adding to it. Um and yeah, people have different I know people have different opinions about when you should tell your story, but I remember when I was expelled from that environment, a mentor that I had at that time at Bob Jones, they told me, "Oh yeah, just go," because I was going to started going. I've been in therapy a year and a half, but yeah, once I left Bob Jones, I started going to therapy immediately to just start dealing with my past. And I remember this mentor telling me, "Oh yeah, don't share your story. Just be quiet, just heal." And to me, telling a survivor to not tell their story, I don't think it's a no, like, that's not a good thing to do,
oh,
especially, like, when we've been in an environment already where we've had people telling us what to do, what not to do is really I feel like
yeah.
also it's kind of re-traumatizing, I think, that, "Oh, no, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't, no, you need to do this." It's like, no. Like, if you're with a therapist, usually they won't tell you that, they'll help to guide you and help you come to a conclusion on your own or figure out what's best for you. And that was what was really frustrating for me in therapy in the beginning is that I wanted this therapist to give me all these answers, And that therapist had to stop me. He's like, Andrew, do you know what you're doing right now? He's like, it's like we're back in fundamentalist Christianity. He's like, you're expecting me to give you all these answers and you don't want to think for yourself. And I was like,
Wow.
oh, yeah. He just called me out, and I thanked him, like, yes, like, please call me out for that. If there's black and white thinking, call it out. Like, please, I want to like undo all of these patterns in my mind. And so
Mm.
I think, for me, since I did have a majority of my story written out, I think that helps me be able to come out so quickly and share it. And mm, having a place to tell your story where it's validated and you're safe and you're not shamed for it. Like when I told my story, that was the first time that someone actually like truly listened to me, truly. And so I had never experienced anything like that, because usually when I would talk to people, even like starting to tell friends a little bit about my past and some of the things, and they would be shocked by stuff and people not understanding that I was dealing with trauma, and I would avoid certain social situations or have anxiety about certain things, and just people would say things like, "Oh, like it's not a big deal," or "Oh, just don't worry." And it's like, you don't understand. Like, no, it's not that simple. And
Well, it's
so,
almost similar to what the experiences of speaking of coming out to your parents, your mom, whose cognitive dissonance seemed to just kind of uh, come in at that point where everybody pretends that nothing's happened and people
yeah.
just carry on as normal. So when you talk about really feeling like you've been listened to for the first time,
Mhm.
you said that you risked it all, and of course with they all people will say with risk comes reward, and also with risk there's the chance that no repercussions are
Mhm.
felt from your decision to meet with this individual on Instagram. I did want to ask you if you could talk to the listeners about the communications that you received from your peers after your appearance on Instagram, because I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, it was fascinating because I was expecting so much backlash from the interview, and I was shocked by how many students my age reached out to me to say that, "I'm sorry for what you've gone through. I hope you find healing. Thank you for sharing your story. It was very inspiring to me." And like they didn't force their religion, they didn't force any ideology, and I was just really surprised by that. And of course, like there were a few haters, but I was shocked by overwhelmingly like shocked by the positive feedback. And I think it was because of the way I approached my story and the way I told it. It was just, I told it how it was. I wasn't hateful. It was a very vulnerable moment. And it was my first time telling it. I nearly like cried a few times during it, but I made my way through it. Um, and so I don't regret doing it. I would still do it again if I could. I don't regret it.
Well, that's the trick. That's the trick title of the panel, isn't it? The right way to tell your story, because there isn't, I don't think, a
I
right
don't
way.
think so. No.
There's different ways to suit different people. Earlier on, we had Stephen Mather and Chris Shelton
Oh,
on
yes.
the show, and Stephen said that he faded out of the Jehovah's Witnesses, and he said he kept his head down and kept to himself. And Chris Shelton said that he left Scientology and came out all guns blazing, like, "Oh, it's a cult." So it's interesting just to see those parallels between how Stephen and Chris approached their decision to speak about their experiences, and coming from the position of content creators with the cult hackers and sensibly speaking, and speaking up with Andrew Pledger, there's different approaches that are taken, but essentially it gives way for you to share your experiences through the medium of talking to individuals about their experiences. So, how is that for you, interviewing other people that have also left cults, extremist groups, high demand religions?
Mhm. Yeah, I think for me, when I was able to escape that environment and I was finally free, I was like, "I can continue to speak up, like, I don't have to be silent anymore, and I'm not going to be," and, like, I love what you said about, like, guns blazing because I feel like that for me, that's how I left Bob Jones University and how I kind of really continue to be since I'm working on a podcast about the school and why it's a cult. Um, but for me, this number one, like the title "Speaking Out with Andrew Pledger," it was just so personal to me because most of my life I was silenced and I was a painfully shy individual growing up. Like I was when our family would go to McDonald's, like I would be too afraid to even like say my order to the cashier. Like that's how shy I was. So I think it was powerful to me to name it that because it showed like I think my growth as a person. And I think it's just a core part of my story because like I got kicked out of a Christian college or a Christian cult for speaking up finally. And to interview other survivors, it's definitely it's had triggering moments and it's been also very validating. And to me, when I started interviewing people from all kinds of backgrounds, I was surprised at the parallels despite being from completely different groups and the same tag. And it was just kind of like in the Wizard of Oz, like the man behind the curtain kind of moment.
Someone said that to me. Who said that to me the other day? Oh, the man behind the. It was in an interview. It was in an interview
Oh, okay. That's funny.
with a former with a former. Who was it? The man behind the curtain. Oh, it might have been Unca Richter.
Oh,
I think it might have been her that said that, and that is just really strange because I don't think
that's
you hear
funny.
that term very often, but here it is
Yeah.
again.
But yeah, that's how it seemed like, um, and I wanted to because I knew how powerful it was for a person to tell their story in a safe space where they could be seen, heard, and understood and really validated. I was like, I want to give that to other people because of the impact that it made on my life. And that's why I did it. And it started out as an Instagram live thing I would do, but it was just at that time, Instagram lives just weren't working well for me. So I just was like, all right, let's start a podcast. Let's just learn as we go. So I really like jumped into it. So, but there's a lot of mistakes I've made with the Speaking Up podcast. And there are moments where I'm like, I don't know, it's not a project that like I'm extremely proud of,
Oh,
honestly.
come on, come on. I do it all the time. But I think what's really amazing about this space is the growth that comes from every interview.
Hmm.
So, of course, I'm an individual that's coming from this, from a, I don't like to use, terms like insider versus outsider, but I'm coming from this, um, industry, field, space as an outsider, without a lived experience in a cult or an extremist group. And I can think of so many things off the top of my head that I've said. I've said things tonight where people have corrected me.
Hmm.
Just like you said to your therapist, tell me when I slip into that. I really appreciate it when individuals tell me, oh, I don't think that's quite right. Like before in an interview
Hmm.
with Nicola Ranson, I said, you've got the really amazing individuals in the Rajneesh movement that you meet, and you've also got the bad people. And she was like, I don't think you can just place all of the blame on the bad people because there is some complicity in the individuals that are also within that system. So that again is a lesson for me. I've learned something there. I'm like, oh my goodness, yeah, no, I shouldn't speak that way. And I can think of so many things that I've said or done where people have corrected me or I've learned something. And I really, really internally, like, my butt cheeks clench and I really cringe at myself and I feel quite embarrassed and ashamed. But But how can we grow if we don't have those
Mhm.
experiences? And that's why I'm leaving all of my episodes out for even the earliest ones for people to listen to,
Mhm.
because I am proud to own my educational
Oh,
journey.
yeah. Oh, I love that. Yeah, and I think for me, with the Surviving Bob Jones University podcast, I'm excited for it because, I've been doing podcasting for over a year and I've learned a lot and I've grown a lot as a podcaster with like editing and production and interviewing. And so I'm really passionate. I've never been so passionate about doing a project as I have with Surviving Bob Jones University, and I'm excited because I had someone is flying in from Ohio to be interviewed in the podcast.
Wow. That
Yes.
that's amazing. And because of the work that you do helping with the social media side of things for the Indoctrination podcast, I imagine that Rachel Bernstein, for anyone that hasn't heard of the Indoctrination podcast, which I'm sure everybody has, is a licensed marriage and family therapist and also works with a lot of cult survivors and trauma victims. Has Rachel given you some special interviews for the podcast?
I mean, yeah, like I've been able to like get different ideas for guests, and it is exciting because I was the first person to interview Rachel to tell her personal story
Yes, yeah.
for and it's on my podcast speaking. So I was so excited because she had never told her personal, like, in-depth story of why she got involved. And like when she hired me as the social media manager for the Indoctrination podcast, she's always been really uncomfortable, which I love about her because she's such a humble person. But she's always was just uncomfortable about just being out there on the internet. She wanted to put other survivors. She didn't want to be like, of course, like her name is on it and she interviews it, but she didn't want to become like all about her, I guess you would say, and all these clips of her doing this, this, and this. She wanted to center survivors. And I'm like, listeners would really connect if you shared your story and why you got into this, to know this other side of you. Cause, she's very educational and it shares a lot of her expertise. But I'm like, I want people should see this
A
more
human, the
personal, this more
human.
human, the more human side. Thank you for putting the words in my mouth. Yes, the more human side. So I was excited to be able to like interview her story, and we had a good time with that. And Rachel, I already interviewed her for the BJU podcast, and she had so much to say about Bob Jones University, so many good things, and I'm so excited for people to hear it. And I think I decided to do the BJU podcast because no one had ever done a podcast about Bob Jones University by itself. No one has ever made a documentary about Bob Jones itself, and it has a long history, and there's a lot there, and it's heavily influenced politics. It's not as powerful as it was, thankfully, um, but it's had a great impact on American culture and politics and Christianity. So I'm excited to do the in-depth, like deep dive, like 15 episodes into Bob Jones University. And I've it's been hard, like I said earlier, and I've never gotten so many hateful DMs in my time in doing this space until I started calling out Bob Jones, and it's motivating me more and more. I'm like, okay, bring it on, bitches, bring it on. Here we go, because I am like ready.
So you have talked about journaling. You've talked about how you put these pictures together through this photography work, which then led to you talking on an Instagram live, which blew up, which then led to you doing your Speaking Up with Andrew Pledger, which has now led to the Surviving Bob Jones University podcast. Within that, there are so many different avenues that you've taken. And also, you've appeared on other shows, other podcasts, and other platforms in various different mediums to share your story that way too. So the right way to tell your story doesn't really exist. There are many different things that people can do. You've mentioned speaking to a trusted friend, consulting a journal, speaking to a therapist, Or all guns blazing, come out, start your own podcast, YouTube series, appear on a documentary, write a memoir. There are so many different avenues that people can take, and there isn't any right or wrong path. And that's a very important a very important thing to say, I think. You have recruited, it seems, Daniela Mestyanek Young
Oh,
to
yes.
do some not only research and videos and her perspectives on Bob Jones University in terms of group organizational behavior and psychology, um, but also perhaps to add some things to the podcast itself.
Yeah, yeah, thank you for bringing that up because I meant to bring that up earlier, but it just slipped my mind. Yeah, Daniela Messonnier Young, she's a big part of the podcast, and I was so happy. I didn't realize she was gonna do a deep dive into Bob Jones. I didn't know she was gonna make videos about it. So I'm so grateful that she has, and she's helping bring awareness to Bob Jones University. I literally was like, I interviewed her for my podcast, Speaking Up, back in April, and the episode is going to come out in a couple of weeks, I think. But at the end of that interview, when I recorded that in April, I was like, hey, I'm making a podcast about Bob Jones University. I know I'm having Rachel on, of course, but I'm looking for one more cult expert. Would you be interested in coming on? And immediately she's like, yes. And so I put together my cult analysis using the bite model and Lifton's criteria for thought reform. And I took everything I knew about Bob Jones and my experiences and all the different control tactics and different things, and I was even like really surprised myself when I put it together. I was like, oh my God, all these different things. And so I put together this analysis and I sent it to Rachel, I sent it to Daniela, and I was like, I'm going to ask you your thoughts and opinions about Bob Jones and my analysis. And so, yeah, so it was so awesome because then, when I was talking to Daniela, she's like, "Oh my gosh," she's like, "This is great content. You should also start making content about this." And she started like seeing making content about the things I wrote in it about like the cults of confession and different things. And I was like, and I saw it happening, and I was like, I'm like, she's making content about Bob Jones University. Like, this is so exciting. And like, she almost has like, I think 50,000 followers on TikTok. So she has this big audience that she's telling people about Bob Jones University. And, she's this cult scholar. So I was like, oh, I'm like, yes. And so I started sharing the videos everywhere on social media, just to really help fight back against the haters who were coming out against me. So I'm so grateful that she has done that. And I've given her more information about Bob Jones. I'm like, hey, if you want to make content, here's some more good juicy stuff if you want to. But yeah, we talked for an hour and a half for the interview for the
Wow.
podcast, and she had so much to say. And she told me, she's like, yeah, she's like, just share the videos that you're going to make from the podcast. I'll share them on all my socials. So I love how she's gone all out to be so supportive of
Yeah,
the
it's amazing.
podcast. And I didn't expect that, but I'm so glad she did that.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. And for anybody that hasn't heard the interviews on the Cult Vault podcast, or who hasn't heard of Daniela Mestyanek Young, Daniela has a memoir titled Uncultured, talking about her time growing up in the Children of God and then leaving at a very young age and then joining the US Army, and drawing parallels between the Children of God sex cult, as she would call it, as a survivor of that group, and the US Army and the cult like aspects of the army and the rape culture of the armed forces as well. So, and now has just graduated from Harvard with a degree in organizational behavior or
Hmm.
something
Yeah.
along those lines.
I think it's saying like organizational and industrial psychology, maybe, or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So Daniela's like this um amazing, eloquent person with all of these experiences and insight, who knits on her TikTok as she talks about high demand groups and different cults, and has really taken to talking about the Bob Jones University. What's really interesting about Daniela's thoughts on Bob Jones is that she doesn't pull any punches. She is just very much like, okay, this is bad. This is what I've and I can back this up with not just my experiences but my education. Um and if that is going viral, if any of that stuff goes viral, if anybody, even anybody in Bob Jones or thinking of going to Bob Jones, or people that have graduated from there, find this content to hate watch, there's a chance that a couple of pieces of Daniela's information could just slip in and they go, oh my goodness, that is exactly what happened to me or is happening to me. And you just don't know, like, even if it's reluctantly, we have no idea the impact that those videos can have, which will lead people to your podcast, and in turn your podcast will lead people to Daniela's work. So it's great to be building this network of information.
Yes, yes, most definitely.
When you release the podcast, are you in fear of any legal repercussions?
Yeah, that's something people have talked to me about, and in the beginning, I did have some anxiety about that, and it's something that people are like, "You need to really be thinking of this." So, I'm doing everything I can to cover my bases, so every single guest who comes on the show, they're signing a form that they're agreeing, and I'm gonna be editing because people they say names, and I'm gonna be editing that out, but the way I am gonna still be able to call out people is to integrate audio that these people have said publicly, so
Yeah.
I can do that, so I can still call out people, so that's really awesome. People being held accountable for the awful things they say in
They
public, so
say, yeah.
yes.
I'm sure,
So
I think um recordings of like Bible sessions
sermons,
and stuff
yeah,
that were put
mhm.
on during the pandemic, and I imagine there's a whole catalog of things to sift through.
Yeah, there is so much, and thankfully, I'm working with, I think, like, they're a historian and they're, like, a scholar of fundamentalism, and
Wow.
they've been so helpful, and the reason I was able to connect with them because this person, their name is Camille K. Lewis. They were faculty, like, they went to Bob Jones, they were on faculty at Bob Jones for many years, and now they've left, and they've really dedicated their life to studying fundamentalism and really keeping archives of like BJU's history and all the things that they would want to cover up and hide from the
Wow.
public. She's been archiving and keeping it safe so anyone can find it and know because there are still things when I was at Bob Jones, I heard from people, they're like, there are things locked away on this campus that Bob Jones does not want the public to get. Sermons that Bob Jones III has said, or certain
Wow.
things that they like lock and key that they do not want the public to hear or to see.
Interesting, interesting. I wonder if we'll ever know or hear about what's in those places, or what's in those protected things.
I know
Um,
it's fascinating to me. I'm like, "Ooh, I
oh,
really
it
want in
is.
it," but
Yeah.
thankfully, there's still so many, things that are public, that are verifiable, that I'll be able to cover on the podcast, and, I've never gone so deeply into, like, studying a group, but as I go deeper and deeper and I've had to take breaks, it's made me more and more motivated because just oh my god, like, for people who want, like, examples, Bob Jones University, they banned interracial dating and marriage until 2000. um, they have that in their history, like, they did that. Um, they also shamed, blamed, and silenced sexual assault or sexual abuse survivors who came forward and told them not to press charges, to forgive their abusers, and
Oh,
they did this for decades, and when this finally came to light for all these survivors, um, Bob Jones University, because of wanting to protect their reputation and really like fix things, I guess. I don't think they want to fix things, but protecting their reputation, they had an outside organization, which that's a red flag that there's never any outside organizations keeping the checks and
With the
balances.
IFB, yeah.
Yeah, same thing with the IFB. So when there's no checks and balances, that's such a red flag. But they had an outside organization. The organization is called Grace, and it stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. The fact that you have a organization just for that, that's another red flag there. So anyway, so this outside organization, they it's called the Grace Report. Anyone can Google it and find it online. It's like 300 pages long of their investigation of Bob Jones University. And once they were done and submitted the report, Bob Jones University fired them because the report is a damning report of Bob Jones University. And um, there were several abusive people that this report told them to fire to get off of the staff.
Wow.
And Bob Jones University did not do that.
Oh, that's so interesting. It reminds me of the Deep End when Teal Swan hired somebody to tell her that she's not a cult leader, and the woman came back and was like, "Well, I don't know if I can tell you that because there's some really difficult things happening in this system." So it's kind of like backfiring on you to hire someone to clear your name, who then says, "Actually, no, I can't do that."
Yeah.
It's here it's the 3rd of June now, but it's the 2nd of June. June is Pride Month, and I wondered if we could end our session today on asking you what Pride Month means for you as an individual who is a member of the LGBT community outside of a high demand religious group or cult, as some people may say, as a person that can live authentically with your sexual orientation.
Mm, yes, yeah. I mean, it's incredible because last June was the first time I was ever able to openly celebrate Pride. I was out of the closet and was telling my story. So yeah, last year, the first time ever I went to a Pride parade, and it was the first sanctioned like Pride parade in Greenville, South Carolina. So I was really excited to be a part of that, but it was also really scary because of just the conservative Christianity controls this town. And, the church that I attended, the affirming church, they would get death threats every week because they were an affirming church, and there would be police there every week to protect us if a shooter came in because of the church was loving and accepting of queer people. So it's great that I was able to do that, but it's since coming out like year and a half ago, like there have been times where it's like it's becoming such a polarizing thing now. There's just seems like a resurgence of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric and so many laws in the US that are trying to be pushed.
Being
And
targeted.
oh, so it's been harder. I think this month I haven't I hopefully I will, but I haven't made any pride plans this month yet. And I do love Pride Month, but my the thing that I really don't like is just the corporate capitalism bullshit that happens, that they use Pride to make all this money and they don't really care. And then once Pride Month is over, they don't care anymore. So it's just that really it's something that annoys you, like when capitalism really gets involved with it. But I do love being able to celebrate it, and I'm working on making like several like very personal posts online talking about like my experiences being queer in that environment. And hopefully I need to figure out when the parade is this month in Greenville. I might end up going to that. But last year when I did it, there was a street preacher who just like ran up to all of us with his stupid little megaphone, like just saying like just reciting all these verses I had heard my entire life, like about Sodom and
Mm,
Gomorrah and all these things. I was like, oh, this is great. But thankfully, because they were like I guess since there was like a noise ordinance or something that person wasn't, thankfully the police like stopped them, so that was nice. And
right.
we had police cars at every end of the parade to protect us. But this year, like part of me was like, I don't know if I want to do Pride this year. I don't know if I want to be out because of safety issues. And I think that's what a lot of people I think are afraid of, especially this year.
And it feels almost well, I guess it is in some ways backwards, because the Stonewall riots and the Stonewall uprising, which sparked Pride Month and, gay rights around the world, really to change and to get us where we are today. The uprising started because people didn't feel safe going to certain
Mhm.
places and being themselves.
Yeah.
So the fact that you are expressing those sentiments is very concerning, and I
Yeah.
think really puts a spotlight on where we are in the world. And it's difficult because with the extremist right, we also have the extremist left, and we
Mhm.
have
Yes.
the extremist trans community,
Yeah.
with the
Mhm.
extremist anti-trans community, and it's fighting fire with fire, and every side is using the same tactics and the
Yeah.
same. So
Mhm.
it's kind of like it's really difficult.
I know what you mean. Yeah. Mhm.
I listened to Julie Jenkinson talk the other day for a Family Survival Trust talk about um how people that are trying to fight for social justice fall into the kind of social justice, political cult extremism side of things, because sometimes you feel like the only way to do things is to be aggressive and extremist, to only the only way to be heard, to make a difference. But then of course we're falling into that territory of both groups are acting the same way. So this is like a thing
I
that
know
I'm
what you
looking
mean.
at the moment with extremism in the world. And that will be something that I talk about in the next panel with Teddy Hose. So that brings us to the end of our talk. Andrew, thank you
Aw,
so much for joining me again. Please tell
yes.
everybody where they can find you and your work.
Yeah, so I'm very active on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok. Just search Andrew Pledger, and I have my podcast, Speaking Up with Andrew Pledger, and the Surviving Bob Jones University podcast. It has the trailer is out, and there's an intro episode, so you can subscribe. Please share, and please give it good ratings to just help with backlash from people. That
Yeah.
would be greatly appreciated. And just, yeah, it's coming August 23rd, which is the first day of Bob Jones University classes. So I'm excited for that.
Nice, nice. I like that. I like that. And Nicole has said you're so brave. Thank you for taking care of
Oh,
yourself and for sharing. And I agree with those sentiments. And I will say thank you very much for joining me, Andrew. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
oh, thank you. It was good talking, Casey. Talk to you
Thank you, Andrew.
soon.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Ooh, things are heating up. We are almost 8 hours in. I can't believe that we are still going strong. That was such a great talk. We've also had some more donations whilst I've been talking to Andrew. A massive thank you to Lee and Sarah and Connor for your contributions to the live stream. The goal is getting closer and closer with every donation. Please, if you haven't, consider heading over to the